Okay, be back with you in a second.
Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick things off this morning. Welcome to a DC update, what you need to know about policies that can affect agriculture with KCoe Isom. My name is Claire Weinzerl, and I'm the communications manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. In today's webinar, KCoe Isom's Brian Kuehl will look at Congressional and Biden-Administration activities that may affect your farming operation in the coming years. Subjects covered will include recent spending bills, proposed budget reconciliation legislation, energy tax provisions, and farm bill discussions. Please feel free to go ahead and type any questions you have into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and Brian will answer those following his presentation. And just one more note that today's webinar will be recorded in case you'd like to rewatch or share with your network. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Brian Kuehl. Brian is KCoe Isom's Director of Government and Public Affairs. Brian helps KCoe clients track policy developments in Washington, D.C. and advocates on behalf of U.S. agriculture. Brian also serves as Executive Director for two agriculture trade associations, Farmers for Free Trade and the Agriculture Trade Education Council. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the Illinois Soybean Association for the opportunity to talk with you all today, and for the long-standing partnership. We love working with Illinois Soybean, and hopefully that feeling is mutual. I know that we've done some great projects over time, and look forward to continuing our work together. As Claire mentioned, I serve as Director of Government and Public Affairs for KCoe Isom. Let me give you a quick background on KCoe in case this is your first webinar, and then talk a little bit about what my job entails, and then we'll get into the substance. KCoe Isom, for those of you who may not have been on past webinars, we are a now coming up on 90-year-old ag business advisory and tax firm, probably the largest such firm in the U.S. We represent family farming operations throughout the U.S., as well as other businesses in the food and ag supply chain. I like to say everything from policy to plate. So I work obviously on the policy side, but we work throughout the food and ag ecosystem. So producers, ag equipment manufacturers, food processors, transportation companies, basically anyone engaged in food and ag, we're helping them look at how to make their operations more profitable, and looking at important topics such as succession planning and estate planning, so that families can pass their ag operations on to their kids. That's an important part of what we do. My role at KCoe Isom is to focus on policy, and I do that in a number of ways. Number one, we do some direct lobbying on issues when a tax issue comes up, or for example, we manage a coalition called the Farm Program Fairness Coalition, which is farmers working together on farm programs. So I'll be in DC next week with a number of people from the Farm Program Fairness Coalition, meeting with FSA, meeting with USDA, meeting with members of Congress to talk about the next farm bill and to talk about what farmers want to see from that farm bill. If you are a farm program payment recipient, and those are really important issues to you, you can join the Farm Program Fairness Coalition. You can find it online at farmprogramfairness.com. So that's one way that I will work on policy, is direct lobbying or by managing coalitions. Claire mentioned another coalition that I manage, Farmers for Free Trade, which, as the name implies, focuses on ag exports and trade topics. And we're very active working as an umbrella organization for U.S. agriculture. So National Corn Growers is a member, National Pork Producers, National Milk Producers, et cetera. And we work together on international trade issues. And then the third thing that I do within the context of policy is really intelligence gathering. We have a number of lobbyists in DC that we have hired. These are not necessarily KCoe lobbyists, but lobby firms that we hire to work with these different associations that we staff. And working with them, then we gather information on what's happening in DC, what's happening on the Hill, what's happening with the Biden administration, and then conveying that information out to our clients and to organizations like Illinois Soybean, so that farmers can make better informed decisions and be up to speed on what's happening in DC that may affect them. One final note I wanted to make before getting into the substance is just the rebrand that is coming for KCoe Isom. KCoe Isom in August will be rebranding to Pinion, as in the little gear that drives larger gears. Pinion is the name that we have been operating under internationally. So we've been expanding our footprint and helping farmers, for example, in Australia and other countries. And we decided it made sense, just since KCoe Isom is a little bit of a mouthful, just to scrap that and go with the full Pinion brand. So you'll see in early August a rebrand of our firm to Pinion, and just know that that's the same company. KCoe Isom will become Pinion. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to run through a number of things that we've been tracking in DC, give you a little bit of a flavor of what we expect to happen over the coming months. I'm also going to talk a little bit about our forecast for the midterm elections coming in November. We'll give you a little bit of a read on both the House and Senate. And as Claire mentioned, an opportunity for Q&A. And I would certainly encourage you, if you have questions on any of these topics or anything related to KCoe Isom, feel free to throw it in the Q&A function. If I don't know the answer, I can certainly find the person that does. So feel free to put any questions in there and we'll run them to ground. But with that, let me try sharing my screen and see if I can get this PowerPoint presentation launched. There, hopefully you're seeing the cover slide. The first topic that I want to talk about is reconciliation legislation. And I'm going to give a little background on what reconciliation is. If you've been on past webinars, you may have heard this, so forgive me if this is repetitive for you, but I think it's important grounding for everyone to understand. The US Senate, as you may know, is divided 50-50, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, and independents. Which means that Vice President Kamala Harris is available to break the tie and be the 51st vote. So as a result, Democrats control the Senate, but by the narrowest of margins, by a margin of 1. In the Senate, in order to move legislation, as a practical matter, you need 60 votes. And that's because of the Senate filibuster rule, which was put in place to protect the rights of the minority. So in the Senate, it doesn't operate typically on majority rule. It operates on a 60 vote margin. So you need 60% of the senators to agree in order to move something forward. Non-controversial issues, they'll move unanimously. Those are less and less common these days, unfortunately, but a lot of what the Senate does is on what's called unanimous consent, where if no one objects, the Senate just moves forward. For controversial issues, you need to get that 60 vote margin, which means if the Democrats want to move a package, typically they need to find 10 Republicans who will work with them. A good example of that is the infrastructure bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act that passed last year, that provided significant funding for roads, bridges, inland waterways, repair of locks and dams on the Mississippi River, for example, and also $67 billion for improving broadband internet into underserved areas, which is most of rural America. So that's an example of where the Republicans and Democrats did work together. They were able to broker a package. It was not as big as what President Biden had asked for, but on the other hand, it was a significant investment in American infrastructure and contained a lot of good provisions for U.S. agriculture. Again, those inland waterways, road and bridge improvements, and even rural broadband, I think, can make a big difference for agriculture and rural communities in which we operate. So that was, I think, a good example of where the bipartisan approach can be used to overcome the filibuster. But not every issue can come through the filibuster with a 60 vote margin. The Senate rules allow for a budget bill called reconciliation. And what that means is that the Senate can pass on a straight party line vote on a 50 vote margin, a budget resolution that sets out the broad parameters for spending for the year, for that fiscal year. Then if operating within the confines of that budget resolution, so if they're not spending too much money or raising taxes more than had been agreed to in that budget, they're able to pass what's called a budget reconciliation bill on a simple majority. A couple of rules related to that budget reconciliation bill. Number one, it cannot include policy. So for example, if Democrats wanted to say, let's allow Dreamers or DACA, let's allow children of immigrants to automatically become U.S. residents, well, that issue would go to the Senate parliamentarian, who is the sort of referee of the Senate, and the parliamentarian would rule, sorry, reconciliation can't do policy. You can't change the substance of law in a budget reconciliation bill. It's only for budget matters. So budget reconciliation can be used to direct spending, to direct tax increases or tax cuts, and to change policy that has a direct financial impact. So for example, one of the big questions that is going to be presented to the parliamentarian is changing prescription drug pricing and how the US government negotiates prescription drug prices with drug companies. That may be allowed to ride on a reconciliation bill because it is fundamentally a budgetary item. If the government can negotiate lower prescription drug prices, that provides a lot more money for the government. It has to spend a lot less on prescription drugs. So that may be a budgetary item, even though it has an element of substance to it, a little bit of policy. It's really a budget matter. So if an item is included in a reconciliation bill, then it can pass the Congress with only a 50 vote margin. So aside from items that have broad bipartisan support, like the infrastructure package, the Democrats' only tool to move legislation through the Senate is using reconciliation. Because the Senate is divided 50-50, that means every senator has, in essence, veto power. And the one senator who's played most aggressively on this front has been Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And he literally has been negotiating with the Democratic caucus for a year, trying to come up with a reconciliation package that the Democrats could move. And over time, that package has included certainly significant climate change provisions, spending for climate change mitigation, some of which goes to agriculture, so funding for cover crops or funding for efforts to sequester carbon in the soil, as well as non-ag provisions. So, for example, incentives for electric vehicle deployment and new electric vehicle charging stations. That package that they've negotiated or been working on also includes a significant energy tax provision. The energy tax provision would tie energy tax incentives to carbon intensity. So right now, the way Congress and the U.S. government has operated over the last probably 20 years is individual tax incentives for individual types of energy provisions. So you have tax incentives to incentivize drilling for oil and natural gas. You have tax incentives if you put in a solar panel on your house. You have tax incentives if you buy an electric vehicle, you can get a tax rebate. And those individual provisions are lobbied for by the interests that support them, by the oil industry in the case of oil and gas tax incentives, by the solar industry in the case of solar panels. And so each provision is somewhat different. They have different amounts of tax benefit. They have different periods that they apply. Maybe it's a 2-year provision or a 3-year provision. The reconciliation package that Joe Manchin has been negotiating with Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Finance Committee, would scrap all of those energy provisions. They'd completely redo how we do energy tax incentives. And instead of having these one-off provisions that are good for a year or 2 years, they would move everything to a carbon intensity tax benefit. And basically the way the situation would work is there would be a baseline. So for electric generation, the baseline would be, I believe, carbon intensity of coal. And for motor vehicle fuels, the baseline would be carbon intensity of oil and gas or of gasoline. And then a tax incentive would be provided for any technology that was able to produce energy at a lower carbon impact. So, for example, if your baseline for motor vehicle fuel is gasoline, if you could show that you could deliver fuel for a vehicle, be it electric or be it ethanol, that produced the same amount of energy, but at 80% of the carbon intensity, then you would get a tax benefit for doing that. And the greater the carbon reduction, the greater the tax benefit. So the concept behind this energy tax provision is that it would be value neutral. We're not putting our finger on the scale for solar versus oil and gas. We're really saying, let's make sure that we're driving carbon intensity as the U.S. priority on energy, or as one of the U.S. priorities. So a novel approach, and I think one that really could benefit ethanol in particular, ethanol and biodiesel to a lesser degree. And that's because I think there are good arguments and good studies showing those have less carbon intensity than gasoline, and also because those sectors can also reduce their carbon intensity even further. So you can incorporate offsets. For example, if your ethanol plant itself has solar panels, you could show that your ethanol is producing a lower carbon intensity from the production. So that's been one of the major discussions in this reconciliation package. Other discussions apart from energy include things such as health insurance subsidies, prescription drug pricing. There have been discussions of childcare tax credits, of universal pre-K. It's been sort of a whole package of items. So those negotiations have been going on for a year, and there's been a sense over that time that they would probably come together on a deal this fall, and that the Democrats would move a package through the reconciliation process before the midterm elections. The House of Representatives has already passed a reconciliation bill. So in order for something to become law at this point, the Democrats need to coalesce 50 votes in the Senate, they pass a bill through the Senate, the House would agree to that bill, and they would have a bill going to the president's desk. All of that changed in the last week when Senator Manchin said that he would only support a narrow budget reconciliation package if it does not include new spending to fight climate change or taxes on wealthy individuals or corporations. Those were new markers for Joe Manchin. Over the past year, he's repeatedly said he would support climate change provisions and would support new taxes. So I think people were caught off guard when Manchin said that. He's since walked back those statements a little bit. He said what he's really said is he wants to see the inflation numbers for July, which means which will be released in August. So Manchin is saying, well, he may still agree to a deal, but he wants to see what the inflation measures are before he agrees to significant new spending. That puts the Democrats in a bit of a quandary because the reconciliation authorization, the budget that authorized this reconciliation bill, it expires September 30th of this year. So if the Democrats can't pass a bill by September 30th, they have to start their process all over. So we're mid-July, so you got the end of July, you got August, you got September to pull together a deal. And in order to do that, a couple of things have to happen. Number one, the deal needs to be scrubbed by the parliamentarian. As I mentioned, the parliamentarian will rule, for example, on prescription drug pricing and whether it's appropriate to have within the reconciliation bill. That scrubbing process by the parliamentarian takes time. It can take 3-4 weeks to get done. So the Democrats can't wait and produce a bill on September 20th and expect to get it done. They need to have a bill ready to roll well in advance of that September 30th deadline. The other limitation is August recess. Typically, the Congress recesses during the month of August. And not a lot of work gets done. So typically what you've seen is Congress works really hard in July to get legislation passed before the August recess. And then they come back together in September to finish up bills. So if Senator Manchin is saying he will not agree to move a bill forward with climate and tax increases until he sees the inflation numbers, and those inflation numbers aren't put out till August, in essence, what he's saying is Congress will not reach a deal until sometime in August or potentially early September, which puts them right up against the window for expiration of their reconciliation authority. So that's put this whole discussion into a little bit of a tailspin about, will the Democrats be able to get a bill passed before the midterm elections? Will they go into the midterm elections empty-handed? Sort of two approaches are breaking out from this dynamic in the last week. First is President Biden's approach. President Biden has said, look, Manchin has agreed to some items in the reconciliation bill. He's agreed, for example, to prescription drug pricing, to allow the federal government to negotiate prescription drug prices. That would be a significant win for Democrats who have campaigned on that issue for quite a while. He's also agreed to extend Medicare subsidies so that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act can continue in states and for lower income families. So Biden is saying, look, let's jettison the climate provisions. If those are what's getting us high centered and making Manchin hold things up, let's just do the healthcare provisions that everyone can agree to. Bring it to me in the next 2 weeks. I'll sign it. It's a big victory. Let's not get wrapped around the axle on climate change. A lot of Democrats seem willing to go that direction. And I think Manchin would probably go that direction if that's what everyone coalesces around. The other approach, though, has been pushed by Senator Ron Wyden. He's the chair of the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over all the tax provisions. And as I mentioned, he spent a lot of time and energy, no pun intended, working on this energy tax provision. It's a really big deal for him. He cares very much about climate change. So as this quote shows, he's hesitant to let this go and let reconciliation just be used for healthcare. I think he wants to try to get some energy tax provisions and climate change incentives put into this bill. And this is a quote from Ron Wyden, literally from yesterday, saying and signaling that he's not inclined to let a bill move that's just healthcare. So that's where things stand as of the last 24 hours. You're getting the latest news on this webinar. There are sort of three paths that could happen at this point. Number one, the Biden path. So we could see the Democrats decide they need a win going into the midterms. They're not going to be able to deal with climate change. They're going to strip the bill down and they're going to just do the healthcare package. They're going to run on the fact that they got healthcare for millions of additional Americans and have saved the government money with prescription drug pricing, making prescription drugs more accessible and affordable for working families. That's path number one. Path number two is that the Democrats managed to broker an agreement with Joe Manchin on some climate change provisions, and you have the healthcare and the climate change / energy provisions. If that path happens, there are a number of good provisions that would pass for U.S. agriculture. So again, I think we would see incentives for farmers to undertake cropping methods that put carbon in the soil. So no-till farming would be a financial incentive. I think you'd also see this energy tax provision that could be very beneficial for ethanol and biodiesel. So by extension, soy and corn farmers. So that's path number two. They managed to get a deal with Manchin. Path number three is that they try to get a deal with Manchin so they don't pass something in July. They work in August to get a deal. They cannot get a deal. Or they get a deal too late. They get it mid-September and they don't have time to get it scrubbed by the parliamentarian. They run out of time. September 30th comes and the Democrats have not passed a bill and they have to head into the midterm elections without a legislative accomplishment to point to. Clearly, that's the Democrats' least favorite option. So I think they're going to drive very aggressively to accomplish one of those first two paths. And that's what we're watching to see which of the first two paths will happen. My gut says it's more likely to be Biden's path. I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, he is the president of the United States and the leader of his party. Number two, Manchin has been all over the map on negotiations. I mentioned these have gone on for a year, and at times Manchin has been in support of the climate change provisions and in support of tax increases, and then has not. So I think there's a lot of wariness in the Democratic caucus to continue to negotiate with Manchin. I think people are hesitant to say, yeah, let's see if we can get a deal, because I think there's skepticism that they can. So I think this might be the situation where a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, and they may take the bird in hand and get a bill done here in the next 2 weeks. So major issue that we're tracking very closely, obviously has significant impacts for agriculture, but also just healthcare and other provisions that are important to KCoe clients. Another topic I wanted to flag for you is a bill that has passed the House. The House passed on a largely party line vote, the Lower Food and Fuel Costs Act, HR 7606. This was a bill that passed last month, focusing on specifically, as the name implies, food and agriculture and efforts to hold down the costs of food and agriculture. Obviously, this is a bill being pursued in the context of inflation, and the Democrats trying to show leadership to bring down food costs and fuel costs in the U.S. Some of the things that this bill does, the bill has a lot to like in it for U.S. agriculture. For example, it authorizes the year-round sale of E15 grade ethanol. President Biden has done that administratively, but I think there's some question whether his rule will hold up in court. Trump had done a similar rule that got shot down by the courts. So having a congressional authorization for year-round sale of E15 grade ethanol would certainly be better for the ethanol industry. The bill contains provisions on concentration in meat and poultry processing. It includes, as this slide mentioned, $700 million for USDA to assist agricultural producers with nutrient management and precision agriculture. So a number of good programs if the package is allowed to pass through the Senate. The Senate, I think, is unlikely to just take this bill up and pass it. Once again, if it were to pass without going through budget reconciliation, it would need 60 votes. And some of these provisions, the Senate probably does not have 60 votes. So, for example, year-round sale of E15, Can they get 60 senators to agree to that provision? Unclear to me. I think a lot of it would turn on how they get the overall package done. So I think there are two paths that we're watching for this package. Number one, we expect some of these provisions that are non-controversial could be pulled out and passed as standalone bills or small packages. And those could happen between now and when Congress goes home to campaign for the November election. And number two, some of these provisions could be folded into a reconciliation package. So even if the reconciliation package is primarily focused on prescription drug costs and healthcare costs, it would not be unreasonable to think that there would be a grab bag title of uncontroversial provisions that Manchin could agree to that might include some of these things, the USDA funding assistance, for example. So we may see some of these provisions pass either as a standalone or as part of a reconciliation package. Other topics that we're tracking, there are continued and bipartisan efforts to get some kind of momentum around immigration. A bipartisan group of senators has been working on a package for a number of months. I'm skeptical that we're going to see something happen. I think, especially in an election year, odds of an immigration package passing are really small. There is maybe a little bit more hope that we would see something specifically on farm labor and agricultural workers. A package on that topic has passed the House, so you could see the Senate saying, okay, well, let's just address this small issue. Even there, though, I'm still pretty skeptical. My sense is that immigration is such a hot topic, such a third rail, that it's unlikely that the Republicans and Democrats will coalesce around any topic. The politics are just too hot on immigration, would be my sense. So again, it's the Farm Workforce Modernization Act that contained a number of ag provisions that were supported bipartisan in the House, but many Republican senators have already said they will oppose that bill. Other topic that we're focusing on is obviously the Farm Bill. I mentioned the Farm Program Fairness Coalition. Again, you can find that at farmprogramfairness.com. The Farm Bill discussions are heating up. The House and Senate Ag committees have held listening sessions, kind of looking at how the 2018 Farm Bill has functioned. Most of the commodity associations, including American Soybean, have been very active in weighing in and talking about Farm Bill and how it affects their members. The focus now is really shifting from that backward look, the listening session type approach, to the forward look. What should be in the 2023 Farm Bill? I think some of the topics that we're tracking and that could affect you and your operations. Number one will be payment limitations and eligibility. How are these programs structured? Are they designed to make it more difficult to access farm payments, or will they keep the system as it is? Lot of nuance there and a lot of discussions. It could go multiple different directions. Second, I think our carbon programs. I think under any scenario, the next Farm Bill will probably include incentives for things like cover crops and no-till farming. What will those look like? How big will the financial incentives be? Will people be acreage limited on how many acres they can enroll? Those are all the topics that we're obviously tracking through the Farm Program Fairness Coalition. I think the big take home on Farm Bill, though, is that nothing will happen on Farm Bill, nothing of substance this year, which means this topic will really roll into the next Congress. And the next Congress is likely to have a Republican House of Representatives. I'll talk about our election forecast here in just a second. But that will change the dynamic pretty dramatically. If you have a democratically controlled White House, a Republican House of Representatives, and then either a Republican or Democratic Senate, that will change how the Farm Bill will be negotiated. And you'll see, both Republican priorities and Democratic priorities reflected in the bill. So we're going to talk about midterm elections, but before I do, I want to just remind you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, we'll get to those after talking about the midterm elections. So feel free to use that, and Claire will be watching the Q&A in the chat box for questions. Okay, so let's talk about the midterm elections. The first thing to know is that midterm elections, the general rule is the party that holds the White House loses power in the House and Senate. It doesn't necessarily mean they lose the majority. Sometimes they just lose the strength of their majority. But with the House and Senate so narrowly divided between the Republicans and Democrats, any swing in either of those bodies has the potential to change control of those bodies. So that is a normal year. The midterms are usually won by the party out of the White House. This is maybe not a normal year. I think the big earth-shaking event that happened has been the Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade, and to a lesser degree some of the other Supreme Court rulings on gun control or on other topics, and the belief that the Roe v. Wade ruling could translate into a change in the way the court rules on contraception, on same-sex marriage. You know, one way to look at this dynamic that midterm elections go against the party controlling the White House is that the voter tends to perceive the party that controls the White House as being in power, even though we have a separate but equal form of government where you've got, you know, a judicial branch, a executive branch, and a legislative branch. Man on the street, Joe voter, says, well, whoever's in the White House controls the government. If things are going well, we're going to give them credit. If things aren't going well, we're going to penalize them. And we kind of like the idea of divided government. We don't trust either party implicitly. So having some elements of the government controlled by the Democrats and some controlled by the Republicans is a way to kind of hedge our bets. A lot of times voters behave that way. And it may not be that individual voters think that, but as a whole, that seems to be where these midterm elections tend to fall out. Unclear if the Supreme Court rulings change that dynamic. There is a plausible argument that Joe voter looks at the situation and says, well, the Republicans are exercising a lot of power right now. The Supreme Court has swung pretty dramatically to the right. It's rewriting things that have been around for many years, like Roe v. Wade. It has the potential to affect rights such as the right to use contraception. We need to balance that power with the House and Senate. So another way to think about that argument would be just one of motivation, that, you know, in a typical year, people are really motivated by anger. So if the White House is controlled by a Democrat, it's pretty easy for the Republicans to get angry and say, boy, that Democrat's really messing with us. Look at all that Biden's been doing. We need to turn out and we need to vote the bums out of office. Same thing when Trump was president. It was pretty easy for the Democrats to get exercised about Trump and say, we need to show up and vote the bums out of office. Where will the anger fall this year? Will you see women's organizations and suburban moms who are angry about Roe v. Wade turning out in greater than expected numbers and thus tipping the election? Or will that anger about Biden and inflation and gas prices and fuel prices continue to be the driving narrative for the election? And you'll have the throw the bums out, meaning throw the Democrats out. And they obviously can't vote on Biden in a midterm election. So the anger is directed at the House and Senate. I think that's the big wild card that we don't know the answer. My own gut is that the Supreme Court rulings probably do tip the scale slightly. They probably make Democratic hand a little bit stronger in the midterm election, but it's not going to be that dramatic. That it's not enough for the Democrats to maintain control of the House and Senate. It's not going to be a wave election where the Republicans all get thrown out. I think Biden has just way too many headwinds between primarily inflation is the big headwind. So gas prices and food and other commodity prices. So I think that probably we will see the Republicans having a good midterm election. That's our assessment right now. Maybe not as good as if the Supreme Court had not ruled, but good enough. 538 is a great political website that we track pretty closely. They run models. So here, these two charts are showing model runs of 40,000 simulations. So they'll run simulations where they'll say, well, let's assume in the Virginia 3rd Congressional District that candidate X gets 47% of the vote and the challenger gets 53%. So they'll run all of these model simulations based on polling that they've gathered. And their simulations show for the House of Representatives, 87 times out of 100 over 40,000 simulations, the Republicans took control of the House, that the House majority is narrow enough right now. They predict enough House seats will swing that the Republicans will control the House after the midterms. Only 13 times out of 100, so a 13% chance that the Democrats would hold on to the House. That seems pretty right to me, maybe a little pessimistic. I might, if I were guessing, put it slightly more, maybe 80-20, but however you skin it, pretty high likelihood that the Republicans are going to take the House of Representatives in November. The Senate, by contrast, is much closer. The Real Clear Politics chart that you see there on the right, their 40,000 model runs are showing 53 times out of 100 the Republicans take the Senate, 47 times out of 100 the Democrats take the Senate. And as you notice, if you look at where those dots are aligned, there's a big cluster of dots right down that center line, which means the Democrats would continue to hold the Senate 50-50, the narrowest of margins. The numbers do matter. If the Democrats held the Senate by 51 or 52 votes, then they would be able to pass legislation using reconciliation, and Manchin would not have as much power. So whether it's a tie Senate or Democrats holding it by 51 or 52 does matter in terms of how the Senate behaves. Same thing with the Republican side. If the Republicans are able to take it by the barest majority, by 51 votes, that gives the Republicans the ability to move legislation, but again, only with every one of their members. So if Lisa Murkowski is reelected and she does not like something the Republicans are doing on reconciliation, she has the same role that Manchin has. So it does matter whether it's a tie Senate or flips one by one vote or another. The other thing to look at with the Senate forecast is not just the polling, and there have been some recent pollings where Democrats have been doing well. For example, in the Ohio Senate race and in the Pennsylvania Senate race, the Democrats are running up in each of those states, which would, I think, translate into Senate control for the Democrats. But also fundraising. The Democrats in the Senate have been way ahead in fundraising in multiple races. Now, a financial advantage does not always translate into a win. We've seen that in past elections. For example, Lindsey Graham, I think, was heavily outspent in the last election, but managed to hold on to his seat in South Carolina. But it's certainly a factor. Sorry about my vicious guard dog decided someone was at the front door. So apologies for the barking. But be that as it may, this is one thing that we're watching closely. Couple of things to think about in terms of what this means. Well, number one, if the Republicans win the House, it in essence ends for the next 2 years the ability of Democrats to move legislation on a party line basis. You won't see anything pass. You won't see a reconciliation bill. You'll see potentially bipartisan legislation. And certainly we saw that after President Bill Clinton's midterms. He sort of, people use the phrase triangulated. He went to the Republicans and said, let's move things that you and I can agree on. So welfare reform happened after the midterm election with Clinton, because he almost felt freed up to work and cut deals with the Republicans where he wasn't able to cut deals with his Democratic caucus. So one scenario is we could see bipartisan legislation. Given how polarized our country is, I think that's less likely than it was with Clinton and in the 90s. I think we're more likely to see standstill in terms of legislation for the next 2 years if the Republicans take the House. The Senate, the control of the Senate, I said just a minute ago, it does matter whether it's a 51 vote or 52 vote margin, and that is true. But remember, with the filibuster, substance takes 60 votes. So you're not going to, whether Republicans hold the Senate or whether Democrats hold the Senate, neither is going to get to 60. It's just not going to happen. And that means you're not likely to see dramatic changes in policy coming through the Senate in under any scenario. So there's talk of, should the Republicans pass legislation to outlaw abortion nationwide, or should the Democrats pass legislation to codify the right to have an abortion nationwide? Neither of those is going to happen. Either would take 60 votes. Neither party is going to have 60 votes for their view on that substance. So in terms of substantive changes, it's just not going to happen with the Senate this narrowly divided, whether it shifts to the Republicans or Democrats. The one really significant difference we will see is if the Senate does go Republican, that gives the Republicans the power of confirmation. So remember when President Obama, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, President Obama tried to move Merrick Garland to be on the Supreme Court. The Republicans controlled the Senate and just said, no, we're not going to move your nominee. So President Biden was not able to get Merrick Garland onto the Supreme Court. The Republicans waited until President Trump came in and then appointed that nominee. Same thing with lower court judges. We can expect that certainly some Biden nominees will get appointed, but we could believe that the Republicans would slow walk quite a number. So in terms of the impact on the judiciary, that's where control of the Senate matters more. And that's one thing that people will be watching very closely in this midterm election. Let me. The other item, just briefly before we wrap up here, that I did want to flag is the 2017 tax bill. So I mentioned the reconciliation package a number of times. The Republicans in 2017 passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on a party line vote using reconciliation. However, one of the rules for reconciliation is that it can't have a long-term negative impact on deficit spending. The budget has to balance over a 10-year period in order to move a bill through reconciliation. So as a result, when the Republicans passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, they had to rely on sunsetting of provisions in order to get their budget to balance. So a number of the tax provisions that passed in 2017 are set to expire at the end of 2025. And this slide mentions a number of those: the child tax credit, the standard deduction, the alternative minimum tax coming back, as well personal exemptions. Republicans would like to make all of that permanent, but regardless of who controls the House and Senate, these provisions right now are set to expire by 2025. So if nothing happens, if we have gridlock, we're going to see some of these tax provisions expiring and provisions going back into place that were in effect in 2016. If the Republicans take the House, the Senate, and ultimately the White House, they could pass extensions of these provisions. Absent that scenario, where the Republicans win in the midterms and then also win 2 years from now and take the White House, you'll likely see an incentive for Democrats and Republicans to have some kind of negotiation on tax cuts, because things like expiration of the child tax credit is something the Democrats don't want to see, whereas expiration of some of the other provisions are things Republicans don't want to see. So there will be a driver for some negotiation on taxes in the coming years, regardless of what happens in these midterm elections. Let me pause there, and I see we do have at least a question and a couple comments in the chat. Claire, would you like to read those, or would you like me to pull them up and read them?
Go ahead and read it. We did get one question in from Rob Schaefer that says, since Senator Manchin torpedoed Build Back Better 2.0 with energy in it, what are the odds the BTC gets through in lame duck?
Boy, great question. And thank you for raising the prospect of a lame duck session. Lame duck sessions, as hopefully everyone knows, are the sessions that happen after an election where control of the levers of power change parties, and that can be either a presidential lame duck or a congressional lame duck. So in today's context, if the House swings Republican, the Democrats suddenly have a big incentive to try to pass legislation before the control of the Congress passes in January. Congress changes control January 3rd. So in essence, from election day to January 3rd, the Democrats are still in control, but they know they're going to lose control. And they could, you're absolutely right. It's a great question. The Democrats could take up any number of provisions, including a reconciliation package, and pass it during the lame duck session. So I think that is something that we'll want to keep an eye on. In terms of the odds of individual provisions, I'd be hesitant to handicap it right now. I think the bigger question is, what will we see happen before the midterms? Then we need to see who controls the House and Senate, and will we have a lame duck? And then pretty quickly, we'll get some sense as to whether there will be an appetite on Democrats' part to move legislation during a lame duck. One big factor is also going to be, does Joe Manchin switch parties? And I didn't mention that in the context of control of the Senate, but it is an active question. You know, Joe Manchin has taken a lot of arrows from the Democrats for refusing to negotiate, or in their view, not negotiating in good faith. You know, at some point, does he just say it's just not worth it? I'm taking too much grief from my own party. I'm going to become a Republican. There are rumors that he has told Senator Thune, if Senator Thune becomes the Senate Majority Leader, if Mitch McConnell is deposed and is not Senate Majority Leader, that Manchin would switch parties and support Thune as Majority Leader. Take that with a grain of salt. Those are rumors. Obviously, they're conversations that would have happened between Thune and Manchin. I don't know that they've been publicly confirmed anywhere. But that is one wild card. And I think that affects this question on lame duck. You know, if you're going into a lame duck, the Democrats would stick together and move legislation if they have party cohesion. If they're like, all right, we're going to be out of power. Let's get these priorities done now while we still hold the levers of power. If Manchin is entertaining the possibility of switching parties and becoming a Republican, he would have no incentive to agree to a reconciliation package during lame duck, which would in essence kill those types of provisions. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but if we want to give that another minute to roll in, this is your last chance to send Brian any of your questions. Brian, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
I would just reiterate again our you know, how great it is to work with Illinois soybean, and I think I would remind people that as part of our work with Illinois soybean, we have tax professionals available to consult with Illinois soybean members. So if you are looking at whether it's these policies and how changes in tax could affect you, or if you're just looking at your current situation and trying to make decisions about estate planning or other topics, please do connect with Claire or others at Illinois soybean, and they can put you in touch with the right people at KCoe who can help you sort through those issues.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate, you know, you can find those tax resources at ilsoy.org, and you can always shoot us an email at ilsoy@ilsoy.org as well. But with that, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So thanks so much, Brian, for your DC update. We find a lot of value in your legislative updates this past year. But I just want to take a moment to thank you again for your presentation this morning, and thank you all for attending. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Claire. Take care.